I wonder what we were thinking. I wonder what we were thinking at the end of the 60s and the early 70s when we decided to turn our backs on our hinterland and confine ourselves in a regional customs union. I won't repeat all of the arguments that I made in the last session about the differential growth rates between the EU and the Commonwealth, although I will repeat one of them, partly because a couple of you weren't there, but mainly because it bears repeating. According to the IMF, the EU is not going to grow significantly at all. It's 0.2% in the next 5 years. The Commonwealth is scheduled to grow at 7.3% per year. Compound that over 5 years. Now you might say, well, that's easy for you to say today, Hannan, with hindsight. It didn't look that way at the end of the 60s. Well, that's true. Nonetheless, go back a step and ask yourself, what is the point of a single market? What does trade do? Why do we benefit from it? Why is it a good thing? The point of a market is to swap on the back of differences. You get something that you can't make yourself without undue expense, more cheaply from someone else, and you then gain the comparative advantage and you sell them something else with the labour you've saved. Adam Smith brilliantly observed that it would be possible, by the ingenious use of greenhouses and fertilisers, to cultivate vines in Scotland, and that it would be possible to press these vines into some kind of passable claret at about 30 times the cost of the claret that could be purchased from Bordeaux. But he asked, would anyone consider it a reasonable use of resources to create, to protect the Scottish claret industry so as to be able to do this? Now, you can see, I'm sure where I'm going with this. How did we ever think that if trade is what we're good at as a country, we would be better off linking ourselves to a group of similar industrialized countries producing the same sorts of things and standing aside from what had until then been our main commodity markets? The bizarre thing about the European Union is not only that it still has a protectionist model, that it still operates a higher external tariff than Britain did, throughout the 20th century against non-EU goods. It's that the EU is bizarrely trying to replicate and export its model, to encourage every other regional association to form itself into a customs union on the EU, of the EU type. So, to pluck an example more or less at random, there is a Central American customs union. And this Central American customs union is not something that has come together and that the EU happens to be in favour of. This Central American Customs Union is a creature of the EU, which has made its trade and aid deals with that region contingent on participation not only in a regional customs union, but in a regional supranational parliament called Parlacen. Okay? Costa Rica didn't want to join. They said, well, we're not really like all these other people. We're a democracy. We haven't had an army since 1948. We've got an advanced welfare system. Why do we want to participate in this regional parliament, which is mainly a way of giving immunity to former dictators? Brussels then said, well, we will then cut off all of our relations with you. We will only deal bloc to bloc, is the phrase. So, Central America is now being forced into a regional customs union where they can sell each other coffee and bananas and cut flowers, just as Europe is in an industrialized customs union. What a bizarre thing that anybody ever got the idea that a country like ours, a trading maritime nation, would be better off without the commodities of the entire world. Tim and Kamal have made the case that we should argue the business rather than the sentimental case, and of course that's right. And I'll do so myself. But don't scorn sentiment completely. There needs to be a ghost in the machine. The business case is surely the stronger if we feel that it is based on some community of identity, on some shared values that go beyond a simple transaction. In the first half of this year, I set myself the task of visiting all of the core Anglosphere countries. And two things were immediately apparent to me. I did various speaking tours in Canada and New Zealand. Two things struck me very forcefully, and it's impossible not to be moved by them as a British visitor. The first, admittedly, I was speaking to self-selecting Anglospherist audiences who'd chosen to come to listen to me. But the first thing that was immediately obvious was how ethnically representative the audience was in Canada, or in Australia, or in New Zealand. People very easily got the idea that it didn't matter whether their parents were from Vietnam or Hong Kong or wherever, that once you came to Australia, that implied taking on a whole series of values, common law and free contract and jury trials and so on, and also with it, an implied relationship with the rest of the free English-speaking world. I'm not sure we've managed as well in this country as we have in some of the other Anglosphere states to make newcomers feel that they're part not just of the UK legally, but a part of this wider community based on shared sentiment. The other thing that you can't not be moved by as you travel in these countries is the war memorials. And I don't want to make a backward-looking speech here, but I want you to pause for a moment and ponder the extraordinary force that twice in the last century pulled 100 million young men, Empire and Commonwealth volunteers, halfway across the world, to take up arms for a country in which in most cases they'd never set eyes. What force could have pulled a young man from the Ashanti uplands and set him to fight the Japanese in Southeast Asia, in Burma, for the sake of a country that was tens of thousands of miles away from either place? I don't think it will quite do to say that it was simply a coincidence of language or simply an ethnic identification. It doesn't explain. It just doesn't. That reduces the First and Second World Wars to some sort of Hutu-Tutsi conflict or some Yugoslav conflict, as though people just happen to be on our side because of a coincidence of the language of it. I think if you go back and you'd ask people, what is it that makes you prepared to do this? On some level, they would have said, I am fighting for better values because I'm fighting on the side of freedom against the side of authoritarianism. And they would have been broadly right. When we think of the West in a political or military sense, we're really talking about the Anglosphere. When we talk about the countries that have been prepared to deploy proportionate force in defense of personal liberty, it's the same countries that keep coming up again and again. There are not many states in the world that got the three big calls of the last century right. That is to say that they were on the right side in the First and Second World Wars and in the Cold War. It's a limited list, but it includes most of the core Anglosphere democracies. And that is not a coincidence. Looking at those conflicts, the peoples of those countries thought, because their institutions had taught them to think, that freedom was worth defending. So many of the values that we now regard as universal are the specific product of an English-speaking political culture. We've stopped thinking of them as peculiarly English values. We don't think of representative government, personal freedom, free contract, the rule of law, independent judiciary, equality before the law for all classes of people in both sexes. These were not things that were generalized. These were things that were exported, having been developed here. The very success of that model has made us lose sight of it. It's rather like saying, where is the English national dress? Every country in the world has one except us. Well, no, actually, we're wearing it now. I'm wearing it now. We no longer think of it as our property, precisely because it became so successful in the late 19th century that it became generalized. So those sentimental values are not to be depreciated. The shared heritage of liberty, which we have in common, is something that is the basis of what is now a huge commercial opportunity. I've been speaking about the Anglosphere because that's what's on our title. We're supposed to be discussing the Anglosphere vision. I realise that there is a slight difference between the Anglosphere and the Commonwealth, which the other speakers have been addressing. It seems to me there is a drawback with doing all of this. Obviously, there's a huge advantage with the Commonwealth, which is that it's already there, it has a secretariat, it has regular summit meetings and so on. But it has two disadvantages. It doesn't include some of the countries which it ought to include, specifically the United States and the Republic of Ireland. And it does include some countries which, on the basis of the criteria that I've just been outlining, representative government, the rule of law, free property, free contract, personal property, struggle to qualify. Let me put it no more strongly than that. By and large, the ones that struggle to qualify are, of course, the ones that are economically irrelevant. That is not a coincidence. They are economically irrelevant because of the policies they've been pursuing. Freedom is a very good business model. But when we look at the case now for a resuscitated Anglosphere relationship as the basis of our strategic economic direction, it seems to me we have technology on our side. For this reason, when we joined the European Union, you could still argue that regional customs blocks were the coming thing. You could still make the case that a country needed free trade with its geographical neighbours because that was where most of the action was going to be. The communications revolution has made that argument absolutely redundant. It is as easy for a company in my constituency to sell to a company in Dunedin as it is to trade with a business in Dunkirk. In fact, it's rather easy, for the reasons that Tim pointed. The New Zealand company, unlike the French one, is English-speaking. It's common law. It uses the same accountancy practices. It has the same unspoken commercial traditions, the same unwritten business ethics. If there is a dispute between the two, it will be arbitrated in a manner with which both parties are comfortable. None of those things is true of the company in Dunkirk, despite 40 years of notional harmonisation, because you can't create by bureaucratic fiat that community of values that comes organically between individuals and between firms. So the case, although I repeat, don't scorn the sentimental value of the Commonwealth, don't turn your backs on what it is we've done together, but the case now is a simple, straightforward, rational one. We have confined ourselves in a part of the world that is shrinking, and we have thereby cut ourselves off from a part of the world which is growing, and a part of the world where we have a natural advantage commercially because of the cultural ties which have been referred to. One final thought. If, as I fervently hope, and it seems overwhelmingly likely, Tony Abbott becomes Prime Minister of Australia within the next year, and I can think of almost no more Anglo-spherist politician in the world than Tony Abbott. And if, and I admit that this is a much bigger if, but the opinion polls tell us that it is a possibility, if Mitt Romney becomes President of the United States in November, then for the first time ever, you would have in the core Anglosphere countries a full house. You would have, for the first time in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Right of centre governments committed to the concept. It seems to me it would be tragic to allow that alignment to pass. It's like Halley's Comet, it's not going to come around again for a very long time. Right? When we have that alignment in place, for heaven's sake, use it to set up some secretariat, some regular summit meetings between them, so that when one or another of those governments changes, you have some institutional architecture in place. Of course, the problem here is the UK government. When I was doing that tour earlier this year, I spoke to all of the likely people. I met Stephen Harper and I met John Key in New Zealand, and they were all absolutely gung-ho for this. And they all said the same thing. Well, the problem is your customs union.